He sat across from his wife and his closest friend. They thought they had won, stolen his company, shattered his trust, and secured their empire. But what they didn't know was that every move had been a trap. Every word recorded. This isn't a story of revenge. This is a story of justice served ice cold. Elian Rhodes stood in his corner office on the 39th floor of the Dominion Tower, the setting sun stretching golden streaks across the skyline of Vancouver. Below, the financial district pulsed with the rhythm of early evening traffic, but Elian's focus remained fixed on the object resting on his desk, the latest prototype of LoomCore's neural diagnostic device. Sleek, precise, revolutionary. It was the culmination of a decade of work, meant to redefine neurological care forever. His fingers lingered along the edges of the device, its smooth surface cool under his touch. Head spent countless nights chasing perfection, building LoomCore from a garage startup into a global name. But this moment of reflection was interrupted by the subtle buzz of his phone. A message appeared, delicate in tone but sharp in implication. "Meet me at Sable Rue at 8. Our first dinner there. Time to celebrate something special. 17 years. The message was signed simply, Ramona. Elian's brow creased. The date wasn't a surprise, their anniversary, but the choice of words felt curated. Ramona had been oddly distant for months, constantly away for consulting contracts, and returning with silence where conversation used to be. Yet nearly 2 decades of marriage taught him to read beneath pleasantries. Something deeper lingered between the lines. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Ivy, clear my evening." "Already done, Mr. Rhodes. And your strategy call with Geneva tomorrow is confirmed. Would you like the latest numbers on the licensing deal?" "Calder will handle it." His voice remained flat, but the mention of Calder Ruiz, his longtime COO, brought an involuntary tightness to his jaw. Lately, Calder had grown evasive. Documents went missing. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Overseas activity had become nearly opaque. As Elian left the office, he made an unscheduled stop at a small boutique florist in Yaletown, the same shop Head visited years ago on the night of their first date. He selected Ramona's favorite, white peonies with a blush of coral, a quiet gesture meant to anchor the evening in sentiment, or perhaps memory. Sable Rue hadn't changed much. It still held the same warm intimacy, with low-hung lights and quiet jazz playing over the gentle clink of silverware. A waiter welcomed him with quiet familiarity. "Your guest is already here, Mr. Rhodes." He followed the maitre d' toward a candlelit table near the back. 2 figures sat close. Ramona's posture was elegant but guarded. Seated across from her, a man with sharp features and an overly confident air, Calder Ruiz. Elian didn't break stride. He placed the bouquet on the empty chair beside him and slowly took his seat. The dim glow from the chandelier reflected off Ramona's necklace, a sapphire pendant he had gifted her 5 years prior. It shimmered now like armor. No words were exchanged. Calder simply offered a quiet nod and a raised glass. The envelope placed in front of them was thick and sealed. Elian reached for it without comment, his motions calm, almost clinical. Paper whispered against linen as he flipped through pages, scanning familiar logos now altered, signatures forged, and internal memos twisted into threats. Ramona took a sip of wine. "You were always brilliant, Elian. Just never brilliant enough to see what was right in front of you." He didn't respond. Years of high-stakes negotiation had conditioned him to suppress reaction. But inside, gears were turning. 3 years ago, Ramona had suggested Calder take over international licensing. Shed claimed it was to free Elian's time for innovation. He'd agreed, unaware that he was handing them a key to his kingdom. She continued, her tone featherlight, "You built something beautiful. Now it's time to let it go." The final document bore the company's transfer clause. His name was still printed at the bottom, but another signature line had already been inked. Calder leaned in, his voice low. "LoomCore belongs to us now. All global accounts redirected. The banks want support your new initiatives, we made sure of it. You're insolvent, Elian." Still, Elian said nothing. Instead, he signed. Deliberately, precisely. He pushed the pen away, stood, and adjusted his cufflinks. Enjoy the meal. I hear the Bordeaux pairs well with betrayal. No one followed him as he exited the restaurant. Outside, the Vancouver rain had begun to fall. He didn't open an umbrella. Sliding into the back seat of his waiting car, his driver glanced back. Home, sir? Elian shook his head. No, Theo. Take me to the office. Rough night? Elian's gaze stayed fixed on the blur of lights outside the window. Not at all. The performance is going exactly as scripted. In the shadow of that evening, back inside Sable Rue, neither Ramona nor Calder noticed the subtle flash from a concealed lens embedded in the bouquet. Nor did they recognize the solo diner at the bar, nor the woman in the corner with a laptop quietly observing. Far from being defeated, Elian had set the stage. And this dinner, this act of betrayal, was merely the prologue to a much larger story. One where patience, not power, determined the victor. And Elian Rhodes had always been patient. The rain continued its quiet descent over the glass facades of Vancouver as Elian Rhodes sat alone in his office, high above the glistening streets. The same prototype device remained on his desk, untouched since the night began. In front of him, multiple monitors displayed surveillance footage in real time. Sable Rue's candlelit tables, Calder Ruiz's yacht at the False Creek Marina, and the hallway outside Ramona Finch's penthouse. Ivy Kessler, seated across from him with her sleeves rolled and fingers dancing across her keyboard, muttered, "Live feed stable. All signals encrypted. Agent Price is monitoring inbound calls. Any sign of outbound transfers?" Elian asked, not looking up. "Not yet," she replied. "But they will start soon. They believe they've already won." That part was essential. For 6 months, Elian and Ivy had coordinated with a discreet task force, led by Deacon Price from the Canadian Financial Intelligence Authority. The operation had started with a hunch, sparked by discrepancies in Lumecor's European licensing accounts. But what they uncovered was a hydra of deception. Dozens of shell companies, quietly absorbing assets from unsuspecting firms, all routed through similar names and familiar hands. Ramona and Calder had run the same con before. They'd simply never targeted someone who saw it coming. "They're on the move," Ivy said, eyes flicking to the monitor as Ramona slipped into a black car outside the restaurant. Calder emerged moments later from another entrance, heading in the opposite direction. "Classic misdirection. Follow her," Elian said. "He's just the echo. She's the source." As Ivy launched tracking protocols, Deacon Price checked in from a secure line. Ramona just accessed a secure drive through a relay in Singapore. "We're decrypting the outgoing packets." Elian's voice remained even. "Trace everything. No gaps. I want every transfer, every signature, every offshore detail." Price chuckled. "Already on it. We've wanted to bring down Weber's operation for years. This is the cleanest path I've ever seen." Stellan Voss, known across a dozen aliases, had acted as the hidden hand behind dozens of asset diversion cases, always remaining just out of reach. Ramona had met with him weeks ago, masked as a routine licensing negotiation. Tonight, they were scheduled to complete the final phase, laundering over $300 million in corporate funds across a web of entities formed over 5 years. What they didn't know was that Ivy had been intercepting keystrokes in real time since the moment Ramona sat down to dinner. "She's just arrived at the portside office on East Cordova," Ivy confirmed. "Price has that location covered," Elian said. "Let her make the drop. We want clean footage." On screen, Ramona was ushered into a private suite. Voss was already inside, briefcase open, laptop humming. She passed him a flash drive with a flourish. The transfer began. Ivy leaned forward, screen aglow, capturing everything. IP routes, packet hashes, transfer logs. Meanwhile, Calder had reached his own destination, a luxury condo near the marina. Inside, his tablet connected to multiple banking interfaces. A small error message blinked. "Access denied." He tried again, then again. In Elian's office, Ivy smirked. He just hit the firewall. Calder's frustration was visible through the surveillance lens. He slammed the tablet down, ran his fingers through his hair, and made a call. Ivy patched in the audio. Ramona, his voice snapped. I can't access anything. What the hell is going on? Back in the port office, Ramona stood beside Voss, watching the final figures cascade into place. She answered calmly, probably just a latency delay. We routed through Frankfurt to be safe. Voss glanced at her. You trust him to handle the last phase? Ramona didn't answer. Her confidence began to fray. This was supposed to be seamless, but something felt off. Ivy muted the feed. We have all we need. Transfers, voice confirmations, physical presence. Add the timestamps and cross-reference with our shell records, Elian said. I want full alignment. Deacon Price's voice echoed through the room. We're almost there. One more confirmed endpoint and we have everything we need for multinational warrants. What about legacy victims? Ivy asked. For prior CEOs. At least 2 deaths labeled suicides. Now suspicious. We're reopening everything. Silence settled for a moment as the magnitude of it all crystallized. Elian finally turned toward the window, his reflection merging with the night. Let them celebrate tonight, he said quietly. Let them believe they've won. Behind him, Ivy compiled the encrypted video, voice logs, account screenshots, and confirmed identities into a growing file marked Phoenix. Tomorrow it would all come undone. But tonight, Ramona and Calder raised their glasses in a high-rise suite, toasting the downfall of the man they thought they outsmarted. They had no idea the real trap had already closed. The morning mist rolled across the private airfield just outside Vancouver, clinging to the sleek edges of the jet waiting on the tarmac. Ramona Finch checked the time on her phone. 6:43. Everything had been timed to the second. In just 17 minutes, she would be airborne, leaving behind what remained of LoomCorp and the man whose trust she had cultivated for nearly 2 decades. The pilot nodded as he approached. Pre-flight checks complete, Mrs. Finch. We're clear for takeoff. She gave a tight smile and walked toward the stairs, her heels tapping sharply against the asphalt. The air was brisk but calm.
No alarms. No tensión.
Just quiet satisfaction. But as she reached the top of the stairwell, 2 black SUVs pulled onto the runway. Then another. The engines idled as doors opened in unison. Suited agents emerged with precision. At the center stood Deacon Price. Ramona Finch, he called out, raising his badge. You are under arrest for financial crimes, corporate sabotage, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. Her hand moved instinctively toward her purse, but an agent was already there, relieving her of it. She stared down at the tarmac, the full weight of the moment pressing against her composure. Across the city, Calder Ruiz sat in his downtown office, furiously typing commands into a now-frozen terminal. Nothing worked. All pathways led to dead ends. All funds unreachable. As he stood to retrieve his secure drive from the safe, a familiar voice interrupted him. Looking for this? Mira Halden, her security credentials clipped to her blazer, held the drive in gloved hands. Behind her, federal agents entered, one carrying a mobile scanner, another a sealed evidence bag. What is this? Calder snapped. You can't just barge in. Actually, Mira interrupted, we can. She displayed a warrant bearing his name and a long list of charges. Calder turned pale as he realized the scope of what was unfolding. The screens, the files, the backups, all seized. From the corridor, Elian Rhodes entered silently. His presence froze Calder. You knew, Calder whispered. You set this up. Elian gave a slight nod. Long before you started celebrating. In the interrogation rooms that followed, both Ramona and Calder were questioned separately. Ramona remained composed, but cracks showed quickly. As evidence was laid before her, paper trails, video surveillance, intercepted calls, her replies grew slower, less confident. Photos of deceased executives were placed in front of her. One by one. Martin Vellner. Parent heart attack. You were in Madrid that week.
Youssouf Demir. Car accident.
You signed the dissolution documents the day after.
Henry Lai. Suicide.
But your business partner had dinner with him the night prior. She didn't speak, but her hand, resting on the table, began to tremble. In another room, Calder unraveled faster. He denied knowledge of the deaths but confessed to the asset transfers. Claimed he was manipulated, that he thought it was only about corporate leverage. She promised it would be clean, he muttered. Said no one would get hurt. Mira recorded everything. Every slip. Every admission. All forwarded to Deacon Price's expanding dossier. Later that afternoon, news outlets around the world reported the coordinated takedown of an international financial fraud ring. Headlines buzzed. Loomcore heist foiled in last-minute operation. Rhodes' betrayal sparks unprecedented sting. And empire of deceit collapses. Elian remained silent publicly. He released no statement, granted no interviews. Inside the headquarters, he returned to work. In a secure room known only to a few, Ivy and Deacon debriefed the operation. Files were backed up to redundant servers, evidence indexed and stored. The code name Phoenix became official, not just for the operation but for what would follow. Ramona and Calder, now facing prosecution in multiple countries, sat in holding cells 20 kilometers apart, unaware of each other's fate. Their story, once a shared conquest, was now a disintegrating illusion. And while the world processed the fall of two financial predators, Elian Rhodes sat in his office, overlooking a rain-soaked skyline, preparing for the next phase. The empire they'd tried to destroy would not just survive. It would evolve. 3 months after the arrest, the echoes of the takedown still reverberated through boardrooms and media cycles. Ramona Finch, once a celebrated strategic consultant, now occupied a solitary cell at the federal detention facility in Saskatchewan. The sleek business suits had been replaced by correctional orange, her perfectly curated persona stripped to its core. Her trial, initially expected to stretch for months, had accelerated due to the overwhelming evidence. Multiple jurisdictions filed charges, and testimonies from former partners and victims poured in. Financial documents, international transfers, forged contracts, the case was airtight. One morning, guards found her unresponsive. The toxicology report revealed a fast-acting agent administered through a capsule concealed in a toiletry item. How it was smuggled in remained unclear. But one fact was indisputable. Ramona had orchestrated her own exit, one final play in a life dominated by control. The media labeled her the architect, a title that spoke to both her cunning and her collapse. But in private circles, particularly among compliance officers and forensic auditors, her name became shorthand for a new class of threat, the long-game infiltrator.
Calder Ruiz fared differently.
He was sentenced to 30 years without parole in a federal facility in Alberta. Isolated from his former network, he spent his days under close surveillance, often requested for interviews by investigative teams seeking insight into corporate fraud mechanics. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was always the same message. I should have left when I saw the signs. Mira Halden visited once, as part of a final debrief. She brought no sympathy, only clarity. You were given a position of trust, she said, placing a single document in front of him, a letter of recommendation Elian had written for Calder 5 years earlier. He stared at it in silence. Some debts never vanish, Mira said before leaving. Outside the prison walls, Elian Rhodes had returned to work, but not to the same role. Loomcore had undergone a metamorphosis. A new division was launched, focused entirely on corporate defense strategy and internal audit infrastructure. It was led by Mira, with Ivy overseeing international coordination. The division's framework, based on the vulnerabilities Ramona exploited, was branded as the Finch Protocol, a nod to the scheme that had nearly dismantled everything. Investors, initially shaken, returned with renewed interest. Transparency scores soared. Whistleblower protection systems were implemented company-wide. More importantly, Loomcore's flagship product, the Neural Diagnostic Interface, was finally cleared for global distribution. Hospitals in Europe, Asia, and North America placed orders. For Elian, it was more than a commercial victory. It was proof that creation could survive destruction. He never remarried. Personal attachments had become liabilities in his eyes. Instead, he channeled his energy into mentoring a select group of entrepreneurs, all of whom had experienced betrayal or collapse. His seminars weren't publicized, nor did they accept payment. He called them foundations. Business isn't about ambition alone, he would tell them. It's about building something that outlasts sabotage. The final reports on Ramona and Calder were sealed under federal directive. But Mira kept one image in her personal archive. The bouquet of white peonies left at the restaurant that night. It had not been chosen for sentiment. It had served as a beacon for the surveillance team. Symbols matter, she often said, especially to those who believe they are orchestrating everything. LoomCore's new headquarters opened a year after the arrests. The architecture was minimalist, transparent, and heavily secured. No closed doors without justification. No meetings without logs. The executive floor bore no portraits, no homage to legacy. Except for one item. In a glass case near the operations wing sat the prototype Elian had once cradled on the evening of his betrayal. It remained unchanged, untouched, but beneath it was etched a single phrase: "What survives must be earned." The world moved on. But those who had witnessed the full arc of the deception knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new standard. A decade had passed since the collapse of Ramona Finch's empire and the trial of Calder Ruiz. Yet their story remained etched into corporate memory like a cautionary inscription in stone. Universities dissected it in case studies. Financial firms hosted annual seminars on internal risk based on the incident. And inside LoomCore, it was no longer just history, it was doctrine. Elian Rhodes had aged, but not softened. His presence at LoomCore remained strong, though he now operated more from behind the scenes. The company's new glass headquarters stood as a monument to transparency and resilience, occupying a former port warehouse now transformed into the most secure innovation hub in North America. From his office, Elian could see the same Vancouver harbor where Ramona once attempted to vanish. That space was now home to the LoomCore Institute for Ethical Innovation, a facility dedicated to training compliance officers, auditors, and forensic analysts. Its most requested course was still titled The Finch Effect. Mira Halden had become the company's chief operations architect. Her department, originally a temporary task force, had grown into a multinational defense division. Governments and Fortune 500 firms contracted them to simulate infiltration attacks and build zero-failure integrity systems. Ivy Kessler, now Director of Intelligence Strategy, ran simulations based on predictive models that tracked patterns of insider betrayal before it could happen. One such model was nicknamed Ramona, not in tribute, but as a reminder. It analyzed personality trends, transactional anomalies, and behavioral red flags across internal teams. It was credited with preventing at least 12 internal fraud incidents in 5 countries. Calder Ruiz remained behind bars. Attempts to publish memoirs or interviews were swiftly blocked by Elian's legal team. The only earnings Calder ever saw were redirected to the families of victims from prior takeovers. He had become a ghost in a world he once tried to manipulate. And Ramona? Her death had not stopped the investigations. In the years that followed, hidden offshore accounts were uncovered across the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. The total sum of diverted funds was estimated at nearly $400 million. Most of it was seized and redirected to restitution efforts and regulatory reform initiatives. Among those affected by her previous schemes were retirees who had lost their pensions, small business owners whose companies were dismantled and sold, and widows of executives declared suicides after financial ruin. LoomCore set up a foundation in their names, offering financial aid and legal advocacy. The foundation's emblem, a single wilted peony, was chosen by Elian himself. Despite this, Elian never returned to traditional public life. He refused awards, declined interviews, and dismissed corporate honors. His reputation became almost mythic, a man who had faced perfect betrayal and used it as fuel to build a fortress against corruption. Each year, on the anniversary of the sting operation, Mira and Ivy hosted a closed-door summit at the Institute. No press.
No speeches.
Just a review of newly detected infiltration patterns, updated defense protocols, and one moment of silence. Elian always attended. He never spoke. But afterward, he would take a walk through the archive wing, where every detail of the Finch Ruiz plot was preserved, wireframes of their shell corporations, decrypted communications, intercepted transfers, and even a preserved surveillance video of that fateful dinner at Sable Rue. The bouquet from that night had been freeze-dried and sealed behind glass. Above it, etched into the steel frame, were Ramona's last recorded words from her final transmission. He didn't win because he was smarter. He won because he waited longer. Beneath it, a second quote had been added years later by Mira. Justice waits. It does not forget. To the outside world, Elian Rhodes was simply a visionary who overcame sabotage. But those who studied the case closely knew the truth. He had turned betrayal into blueprint, manipulation into measurement, and revenge into reform. His greatest creation wasn't the device that made LoomCore famous. It was the system that would make such betrayals nearly impossible to repeat. And in an age where trust remained the most valuable currency of all, Elian had ensured it would never again be given lightly.